Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'm Susan Sherrill. I'm the Emeritus Chair of 21st Century China Center and Research Professor at GPS. And I've been away for a while, so it's really a treat to be back and see all of you. I was in China the last 5 weeks teaching at Schwarzman College, Jinhua. And I returned just in time to introduce Lü Xiaobao, who is one of the leading political scientists working on the Chinese political system. And we're so excited that he has moved to Berkeley from Texas and is now associate professor in the political science department at UC Berkeley. So it's nice to have him just up the road and we can see more of him. He's a terrific political scientist who has written a number of books, and his work is notable for its integration of fiscal policies, party building, and state-society relations in authoritarian regimes like China. And he's done work on career incentives for Chinese officials and local officials, education, spending, and public opinion, a lot of very important work. Now, his new book is on the Republican era and the competition between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang during the Civil War and the war against the Sino-Japanese War. The book is called Domination and Mobilization: The Rise and Fall of Political Parties in China's Republican Era. So it's a fascinating book about the contest between these two parties. You can learn how it didn't have to turn out this way. In fact, it was kind of a surprise that it turned out this way. And he addresses the very important question of why it turned out this way. And there are, from my point of view, as someone who studies the Chinese Communist Party as a governing party, this also has some very important implications for party politics today. So it's my pleasure to introduce him to talk about his book. Thank you.
So thank you, Susan, for the generous introduction, and thank you all for being here. And it's an honor to actually first time present my book at the 21st Century of China's study here, because I felt that this is the perfect audience with both scholars as well as future policymakers, as well as people coming from different disciplines. So this book's actually then turned, just like Susan mentioned earlier, there's a lot of twists and surprises. And this is not originally how I envisioned this book is about. Originally, I want to study the state buildings in China and Taiwan after 1939. But the more I talk to people, look into their policy, politics, almost everyone, I don't know why the slide is automatically regressing itself. But everyone's telling me that you have to look into the pre-49 era. So that's get me interested in it, and then start looking into the party archive and other materials, and found that it's more fascinating. Study the pre-49 China, in part because this is the period where the CCP is the underdog, and more importantly, this is a period China is more comparable to current many failed states or developing democracy where there is an intense competition among different political organizations, as well as a country that under foreign invasion and then also the central governments. So let me just wait for a couple minutes out for them to fix
Technical problems there.
So let me just continue saying this is an exercise that took me a while to figure out because as Susan mentioned, I started out studying contemporary China and not a party person. There's a lot of self, teaching, but also a lot of humbling experience, reviewing how much I do not know about party, not know about the Chinese history, and a lot of humbling experience, like learning from historians and social scientists sometimes take things too much for granted. The social historian actually reveal a lot of important insights. So let me get this start by presenting this graph showing you two parties and in terms of their total party membership from 1921 to 1949. So without giving you the label, who can guess which one's KMT, which one's CCP? So there's one party, let me give you a hint, have tremendous expansions during the Sino-Japanese War of this square. How many of you thinking party P is the CCP? Maybe a few of you. Well, actually, the party that underwent tremendous expansion was the KMT. So we can see that throughout from 1921 to even to close to 1948, KMT have much larger party membership over the CCP. And they have an even bigger membership drive during the Sino-Japanese. Okay. So some might say, okay, KMT party, a lot of them are from the military, right? They are forced to join the party, not really the party that that rank and file. So if we exclude just the rank and file party member, this KMT members still outnumber the CCPs. So the point I'm trying to make here is that looking from with a high side, look like the rise of the CCP is inevitable. But when you're at the moments of contestation among these two parties, it's hard to tell. And at anything, many people place the bet on the KMT as the winning party after the end of the Sino-Japanese War over the CCP. I don't know how many of you know that even Soviet unions gave more aid to the KMT over the CCP twice during the First United Front and the Second. I guess the only persons or only people saw the coming actually is from the Dixie mission. The Dixie missions sent from Washington to Yan'an in 1943 and to gather some intelligence. And they actually wrote a report telling Washington that the CCP would have a chance actually winning the Civil War. But of course, with the anti-communist sentiments, and Washington brushed that away and decided to work with the KMT. So the central question that I'm trying to answer in this book is why did the Simony Dorm, why is the Simony Dorm the CCP that triumphed over the KMT? And there's a lot of argument being put out there, but I would like to put forth maybe 3 arguments that intertwine with each other. The first one I like to argue is that for the rise of political organizations during the revolutionary movement, before they seize the power, that you need a dominant leader. And importantly, this is not a story about a great man with visions. This is a story about the relationship among party elites and the dynamic balance power among. The second argument I would like to make is the importance of resource mobilizations, over not just that mobilizing political activists is not important, but mobilizing resources has been overlooked. And I will argue that the fragility of the CCP in part is because they have a very weak mobilization infrastructure. And the last thing I want to emphasize is just one thing I keep learning from historians is contingency matters. In this case, as Susan mentioned earlier, does not have to turn out this. So I have an actual analogy sometimes I want to explain it to someone else don't understand part of the history of political science in general is how to put this together. One analogy I came up with is think about building a party like building an F1 car or race car team. It's a team sport. You need to have a good driver. You can't have too many backseat drivers. So that's the role of dominant leadership. Then you need to have a good car, to have a nice engines to propel you to win the race. But having a good driver, having a nice car does not mean you win every single race. So that's the third part where contingency matter in some ways. So let me hopefully go over my arguments and the evidence that you can see the connection amount. So part of the research process is really try to be a student of Chinese politics, go back to the original, and go to the party archive. And this is a period where I think that when I started this project 8 years ago, you cannot really use ChatGPT or AI to summarize. But I do learn a lot of tremendous insight. I don't think ChatGPT can help me to understand the insights. In some way, I work like a detective, just trying to connect the dots. Which is extremely rewarding. So one thing before I go into my argument, you might ask, why matters, right? Because right now, a lot of attention have been gravitated towards regime resilience, the US-China relations. Those are definitely important topics. But I think to understand political development in China, we have to go back to its origins. I mean, our behavior, our decision, all shaped by our past. Sometimes we learn from our success, sometimes we learn from our mistakes. So I will argue the intra-party elite competition, meaning the competition within the party elite, is really help us, and then the way they build their party really help us to understand the CCP's behavior today. And to some extent, sometimes start to see some of the KMT behavior during the periods that being illustrated in today's CCP. And importantly, I will argue that it's during this period that the Chinese Communist Party learned how to manipulate the tension within the society to implement difficult policies. The key thing they learned to do is how to direct those tensions from state to society to tensions among the people themselves. And also there's a victim of success in a way that they later implement this strategy, mobilizing the masses relentlessly, and led to the lack of institutionalization of the Chinese economy. And beyond China, I would argue that, as I said earlier, this is the period China is really comparable to many contemporary failed state and developing democracies. And this is a period thinking about how to build organization when the organization's very own survival is on the line. And in this period, I think a lot of experience of the CCP actually later, not surprisingly, become role model for some rival organization that is certain. And also, I want to take a slight departure from this conventional wisdom now, about authoritarian politics, about power sharing. And I would suggest that in this particular context, having a dominant leader is more important than have a power sharing structure. And lastly, I think that we really ought to focus on parties' mobilization infrastructure to understand the strength part. So let me go through my argument one by one. The first is the importance of a dominant leader. So thinking about building a political party during this time when there is external contestations, often violent struggle with oppositions. So I will argue that any party building efforts face this three problems. The first is a free rider problem, meaning that given the scale of resources, you rather someone else dedicate their resources to build a party rather than excel. And more importantly, I will argue that there's a distributional conflicts, meaning that certain party strategy might strengthen one area of the party or one certain department of the party, and other people might see that this is a way to strengthen the intra-party the status, and they worry about that eventually could undermine their own status within the party. And last one is that when we're talking about this, the period where the party survival was very much on the line, and it's just, we have unpredictable outcome. So not every party's building strategy is going to work. So in this case, that you have a status quo bias is really sometimes people will not try to dedicate the resources in part because they don't know whether it's going to work or not. So in this context, I argue that thinking about if you have equal balance power among two party elites, say Xu and Ni, and now there's a dilemma here that if we build a stronger party, I'm worried that you're going to build a party that strengthens your position, become the next leader of the party, than my own factions, and you will have the same concern about me. So in this case, you're not going to devote wholeheartedly to the party building because there's competition between us. Now, when there's a dominant party leader emerge, then in this case, that say there was another person which is a dominant leader. So now we know that very much that we know our place within the party. We're not going to compete among ourselves, and we're going to devote this whole resource building a stronger party because now our survival is transcended from previously survival within the party to survival with the party. Now, this is not the case. I'm saying that dominant party leader is going to solve everything. And you have a party who make mistakes, right? And at the same time, with the dominant party leader, you still may have competition among different factions. But what I'm trying to argue is, under these circumstances, at least the party building strategy is not going to be conventional. And they're not going to be a self-defeating party strategy, in part because the people worried about that strategy can undermine their own power. So let me give you some gleam of evidence. Think about the problem of KMT, right? We all know that in the pre-49 era, KMT constantly is considered as a weak party. Eastman's and others have documents a lot about how we did. That's in part because Chiang Kai-shek was never able to consolidate his power, even after the onset of Sino Japanese. And in that case, that you see that starting with the secession battle after the passing of the Sun Yat-sen, that because he was not one of the party elders, right? He's a military man looking in. So he's really worried about the party building effort within the KMT is going to strengthen his political rivals' power under my ears. So much so that he orchestrated April 12 Shanghai massacre to push out the CCP and eliminate all the mass mobilization infrastructure within the KMT apparatus. And later on, he relies on elites. But when you're absorbing elites into the party, that meaning that those are the ambitious people, and they have a lot of pushback. When he moved to Taiwan, a lot of strong oppositions either captures in mainland China, die, or decides not to, fled to Taiwan. It was a sinking ship that they thought that PLA going to come over anytime soon. So he was able to consolidate a lot of his power in appointing people and have a better success in doing all. And I will argue a more telling example is looking at the CCP's party strength before and after Mao's rise to the dominations. Especially looking into the party archives, you find that there's a lot of back and forth fighting about who should truly represent as the vanguard of the party. And in part because the lot of elite power came from their endorsement from the Kuomintang, Soviet unions. So many of them trying to apply, the Soviet Union doctrines to recruiting workers and sometimes excluding intellectuals. And there's a lot of back and forth fighting, not until after the Junyi meeting in 1935, when Mao finally started rise to the leadership circle, even though he was not a party leader yet. But the party leader at the time, Zhang Wenqian, was a very open-minded delegate with a lot of power. And then I will show you later that he able to eliminate two of his biggest threats, Wang Ming and Zhang Guotao, during this period from 35 to 38. And then you start to see the shift in party building strategy become more coherent. And they start now that not to denounce intellectual and welcome rich peasants even to join the party. So during this period, they really start building the foundations, become a party that be more pragmatic, building a stronger infrastructure in rural area. Now, as I said earlier, having a dominant leader, like having a good driver, is not enough, right? You have to, it's a team sport in some way. That building a party, we have to have the infrastructure. That's where I want to move on to my second point about the importance of resources mobilizations. So we tend to think about what kind of a party should be their mobilization efforts. We tend to think about political activists. But in democracy, campaign finance by mobilizing resources for elections is important. And in this case, you mobilize resources for the survival of the party that even activists cannot fight with the empty stomach or empty hands. So my argument here is that you really need to have a strong resource mobilizations, for the survival of the party. But more importantly, that you need to have the infrastructure power to penetrate the society. Now, there are two types of strategies that I would say is not that one dominate the other, but rather they have a different trade-off. One strategy is that you have a more elite-centric mobilization infrastructure. And in some way, this is a more pragmatic approach because that you bring in those elites that have their social capital network, and then through indirect route get their cooperations. So we get a head start to have access to state resources and to other resources in the society. But the problem is, as I said earlier, that you now bring in a number of powerful people in the room that ought to create conflict. But most time, that despite those conflicts, that with the resources, they still can manage. For the mass-centric mobilization infrastructure, that you really build this kind of foundation to penetrate the society. But the problem is building this kind of an infrastructure is highly costly, have a high initial costs. And there's a reason that many revolutions of party was 1 week because they don't have that resources to build this kind of infrastructure. So this story actually play out nicely in the way when we look at the early political development in China. So the KMT actually succeeded before the Sino-Japanese War. They're able to build this protection pact with the economic needs and to raise their revenues. And at the same time, the CCP struggled to institutionalize this. Let me show you what I meant by that. So this is showing you the share of the revenue came from of the KMT revenue from 4 different sources. The darker the color is consolidated tax. Think about this as sort of a sales tax. The second one is the salt monopoly. The third one is the custom revenue. The fourth one is foreign. So I stacked the first 3 is like the indirect taxation revenue sources. You can see that from 29 to 37, they account for, I would say, 50 to 80% of the revenue, where foreign remain a small share, and their total revenue really triple over this period. And some KMT historian would call this the golden Nanjing era, where they really succeeded in some way to build a state dealing with very hostile, challenging environment. Meanwhile, the CCP story is more like a roving bandits. They first relies on Kuomintang for foreign support, which is very meager. They don't get much. They even have to fight with the people at the Far East Bureau for funding and write letter to Stalin saying that those people are not responding. And started in the 2930 when they start to develop the Soviet base area, they found another new source of revenue through expropriations of the landlords and rich peasants, and those revenue outnumbered the Kuomintang pains. And during this period, it's not that they have a taxation regime that successfully to achieve compliance. It's they achieve compliance through coercions, the red armies, as the quote-unquote tax collectors. was so important that in 1933, when the party center asked the Red Army to refocus on the battlefield and let the border governments to let the tax, and they couldn't succeed, so they have to reverse the order 6 months. So in some way that Chinese party historian Yang Huisheng talked about the prerequisite for party independence is really need to have a strong mobilization, resource mobilization capacity. But everything changed during the Sino-Japanese War. So in this graph, you can see that KMT have a serious problem collecting resources, tax revenue, indirect tax from the sources that they have succeeded before, where the defense spending skyrockets. So this is a way to think about the war in some way, not just strengthen the CCP, more importantly, weaken the KMT during this period. Where the CCP achieved tremendously in rural mobilizations. So let me walk you through this graph. I know there's a lot of number of bars there. So in 1941, both parties were forced to extract grains from the rural area. So this is a form of direct taxation in kind. So instead of paying money, they pay grains. Okay. So the highest bar is the share of grain extractions as percent of total grain productions. So the black bar represents the KMT national governments. You see that they go from less than 5% to the higher 43 to close to 10%, and level down later. So on average, it's about 6% of the grain production, which is quite remarkable thinking about even Qing dynasty at its peak about 3%, right, extracting the grain. But look at different level of extractions from the CCP in different base area, in Sangani, in Jingshui, and Jingchaji. So in Jingshui, this is where near the Shanxi and then maybe northern Shanxi part of the area. So this is at some point in 41 is more than 20%. And then later that even with slight decline it reached on average it's about 18% during the entire period. In Sangani, this is the party headquarters located is on average about 10%. And more importantly, this is not just a story about expropriations. This is a story that where they penetrate and 90% of rural households actually pay grain to the government. And another figure is trying to see how much they relies on this kind of direct taxation as a total revenue. You see
Can I just ask to go back?
Yes.
Is this coerced or voluntary?
This is more, I would say, I use the words, let me use quasi-compliance, meaning that mostly it's voluntary, but with some sort of coercion. But this coercions, I don't know, maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. It's more about building this coercion from your neighbors rather than the state coercing. So let me just give you one example of they organized this so-called democratic meeting where everyone in the village come together after this meeting to report their grain outputs. Now you create a prisoner's dilemma. So if Susan is my neighbor and she underreports, I will reveal her, expose her, because I know if I underreport, she will expose me. So in this kind of public setting, they create this kind of personal dilemma. They solve the first problem when they come to taxation is assessment, how much grain being produced. Now, with the village or the high social capital that we trust each other, so we're going to lie together. So they create another scheme, basically like a zero-sum game, so that if Susan pay less, I have to pay more. So in this case, this is where I talk about the mobilizing compliance. They redirect this tension when it comes to taxation, usually is the state society tensions, right? So I blame the state taxing me too much. Now this tension completely shifts. It's about my neighbors underpaid, underreport that hurting me, rather than the state importing too much. So this is, I would say, this type is somewhat voluntary, but with type of coercion or pressure, not necessarily from the state, but from among the neighbors. And that's where the genius of the mobilize compliance, learn to manipulate the tensions within the society. So this is telling you basically a figure that the CCP rely a lot more on taxations when it comes to revenue, when it comes to the KMT. The reason there's a decline in Jingxuan and Sangani later is what Chen Yongfa first wrote about this is the opium trade that helped substitute some of the revenue from Sangani and Jingxuan. So lastly, you now have a good driver. You have infrastructure, have a good car. Does that mean that you're going to win every races? The answer is no. So throughout this entire research experience, I found that there is important role played by contingencies. So I know that when we're looking back of this period, there's always this argument, right? Is CCP the product of this particular period? I mean, using the CCP's narrative, the time the people have chosen us, right? And also there's many discussion about the brilliance of Mao versus the blunder, mistake error committed by Chiang Kai-shek. So I think we have to be careful about whether these people are the event making men or they're the eventful men, meaning that their behavior is shaped by contingencies. So the way to think about this is whether the party strength or their intra-party elite competitions, they often reach a stalemate or equilibrium. And there is where contingency plays the most important role. They disrupt the equilibrium, shift the elite competition to a different path, or switch the party strength. So let me give you one example about so there is actually an example in both parts when we look at the elite competition with CCP and KMT, where the exogenous shocks shake their elite parties' leadership struggles. But let me give you one example about probably a question in many people's minds is Mao's path to power, right? So Gao Hua, this Chinese historian, had wrote this excellent book about the Yan'an ratifications, the rise of the Red Suns, right? Focusing on the Yan'an, the Star ratification period when Mao consolidated his power. And definitely that period is extremely important that he was, consolidate his power. But I will argue that there's critical period where he really cleared the obstacle to his power is during 35 to 38. So the first obstacle is Wang Ming. I don't know how many of you here know about this figure. And he was a protege of some leader in Kuomintang. And in some way that he felt like he had the blessing of Stalin and Kuomintang and insert himself into the Chinese politics. And one instance is in 1931 that he returned from Moscow and actually helped stage pretty much a coup d'etat within the Central Committee and reshape the leadership. Then he left later to Soviet Union and then returned in 1937 and tried to insert himself into the elite competitions. But then Deng Bishi came from Moscow, apparently have a paragraph, a note from Stalin telling him that not to challenge Mao during that period because Stalins want to have less elite competition so the CCP can focus fighting the Japanese. And importantly is that he thought he could build his power base through the Second United Fronts when the CCP established its Changjiang Bureau in Wuhan. So because he really did not have his power base domestically in China. So all he has is the blessing from Stalin or from Kuomintang. But as we all know, the Second United Front collapsed, so he didn't get a chance to build his power base. So it's during the Yan'an Zhengfeng, the Yan'an ratifications that he really lost his reputations and then become a secondary person, a marginal figure in the leadership circle. But it's in the 38 that the letter from Stalin telling him to not fight with Mao played this critical role. But actually, he's not the most severe threat to Mao's leadership. Even Mao admitted, actually, the most severe threat to his leadership was Deng Guotao. So Zhang Guotao is another party leader, have a background mobilizing workers, and during the Soviet base building areas, he also built a strong base in the Jingchaji area. So during the Long March, when he was leading the Red Force Army, when they met the Red Force Army, and actually he has a stronger, better equipped army base, more men, more equipment. But he made the crucial mistakes that decides to split and march into Sichuan, trying to build a Soviet CCP base there. But Sichuan actually have a stronghold, the KMT, and actually defeated him. So he basically exhausted all his military strength during several battles. And when he finally returned to Yan'an, he lost his pretty much British and resources. And eventually he defended to KMT when he sensed that he lost his power. So the Sino-Japanese War is another critical moments where the fortunes of these two parties switch. As I showed it earlier, that the KMT is really weakened, was weakened of EV mobilizations. So let me just show you this graph. Before 1937, this is their tax base. So this is the provincial share of revenues come from different provinces from the consolidated tax. Taxations pretty much in the coastal and northern part of China. When it comes to custom revenues, you see that again in the coastal part of China and then the southern revenues, right? Now when the relation begins after the Sino-Japanese War, you can see that by 1940, pretty much they lost all the territory that they used to be a strong base for their revenues. So in fact, actually 70% of the revenue were lost, and after they were captured, occupied by the Japanese. So you really don't need a rocket scientist by looking at this two map. You figure out that the source of the physical source of KMT's strength was undermined by the Japanese invasion. So I would like to conclude by arguing that when we think about this period of political developments in China, really these three factors, leadership, mobilization infrastructure, and contingency together help us to explain why the CCP were able to overcome all the odds and able to defeat the king. I mean, I would like to leave you with a counterfactual. I think the elephant in the room is the Sino-Japanese, right? Without the Xi'an instance, where the two general house arrest, Chiang Kai-shek forced him to stop fighting, attacking the CCP, and then really, form the Second United Front. The CCP will be finished because at the end of a long march, when they reached Yan'an, they had about 10,000 people left, and they were surrounded by all the KMT troops, right? The Xi'an incident really changed the history. But the counterfactual that I like to present here is that has Mao not to become a dominant leader, say Wang Ming or Zhang Guotao able to become the leader during that time, they will be promoting type of a mobilization strategy focusing on workers. Then the CCP will not have built the infrastructure to mobilize in rural China, and maybe they will not succeed despite the political vacuums created by the Sino-Japanese. So I will leave it at that, and welcome to your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Well, that was so interesting, and one of the I'll just start with the first question, so all of you can be thinking of the questions that you want to ask. From my perspective, interested in contemporary politics, I find that this argument about strong leader preventing splits in the party and necessary for victory in the Revolutionary Party really quite interesting, because now, compared to the collective leadership that we had for much of the post Mao era, we have a strong leader once again. So I'd like to ask you to say how you assess Xi Jinping as a strong leader, and whether or not you think that his style of leadership will prevent any schisms in the elite in the future and make for a strong party. I do think it's really interesting that right now, party building is like the #1 metric for evaluating leaders, local leaders in China, the leaders of all institutions. So this whole party building notion that is the subject of your book during the revolutionary era, the CCP is still kind of, or at least Xi Jinping is very focused on the whole issue of party building. So I'm wondering, what are the implications of this, of the need for a strong leader, and how you assess Xi Jinping compared to other leaders in that respect?
So thanks, Susan. So there's actually, I think, 2 questions here. First is how, from my assessment, how strong she is a dominant leader. And second, how this dynamic shaped the party building efforts of the CCP, right? On the first questions, I think it's a little tricky, I would say, right? On the one hand, we would say that he's such a strong leader because there's no obvious political rival within or outside of the party, right, to challenge him. But on the other hand, if you're such a strong leader, you don't have to use coercions all the time to try to get people to agree or submit to, right? So one analogy I like to use is that when he started anti-corruption campaign, he kind of like in a boxer pushing his opponent in the corner. Now he's not so strong that his opposition will say, okay, you're the #1, I'll stop the fighting. So that's why he have to continue to keep punching, keep pushing to make sure the opponent don't have a chance to fight back. So in that sense, that's why we see this anti-corruption campaign has been ongoing with very degree of intensity, but much more intense than before. That he had not stopped this anti-corruption purging and fighting in some way, so that maybe he's not that solid in his power consolidations. But when it comes to party building efforts, I do see that he has this push in some way to revive the party, because during the end of Hu Jintao term, I think that given the corruptions and then the elite captured in this Chinese society, and the support and trust on the party has declined. In some way, I would think that period, the CCP start to show some signs, share some similarity with the KMT, where you see there's more elites, more bureaucrats in the party than say the peasants and workers, those people as the demobilizer at the grassroots level. But under his leadership, I do see a shift emphasizing the mobilization infrastructure penetrating the society and penetrating the private enterprises, and as well as the mobilization during like a disaster during COVID, right? In some way, I do see that now the party building efforts were become more emphasized. But the key question is, how strong is that infrastructure, right? So I think this is a question that we need to study more about, whether it is a genuine a strong party or a strong party, on the surface.
So sorry to drag you into the present, because your story is very fascinating in and of itself, so let's have some questions about the competition and the strategies of CCP and Kuomintang.
We've got a question from online, which is whether the war against Japan doomed the KMT or whether there was anything the KMT could have done differently during the war or afterwards to avert collapse.
So one thing that I did not talk about in my book is the crucial period of 45 to 48. This is the Civil War era. I think there is some excellent book out there. Susan Pepper earlier have written the book, and then Parks Cobble have written recently another book focusing on economic policies. And to back to this questions, I think this is a question I've been thinking about myself a lot of time, is that really was the KMT boxed in some way that is hard for them to overcome that limitations. And in some way, I would say that really the Southern Japanese war played an important role, as I showed earlier, depleting their fiscal source. And then later, that's why they have such a hard time to managing the macroeconomic stability. And so much so that I think even if we put Mao, just for the sake of a thought experiments, as the KMT leader during that time, I would think he have a hard time to put things together. So in some way that the KMT do face some severe structural limitations in undermining their power. That things that we cannot always attribute to Chiang Kai-shek's blunder, because they are facing a challenge. And actually, I was talking to one of the listening scholar from Taiwan and talking about today's KMT is also facing some structural constraint for them to mobilize the voters.
Hello, I'm Allison from the Poli Sci department. It's very interesting to see this presentation that actually without any like stars and significant correlations, but nevertheless, I'm still very interested, and I don't want to bore people with asking for any correlation. But let me ask this question about this commitment problem. After, especially you mentioned the Xi'an incident. Actually, this has been a major historic question that like why after the house arrest, like Chiang Kai-shek had to follow his promise. He didn't have to. And also at that time, after the incident, it's hard to have a mechanism that coerced him to follow his promise. So there is a significant commitment problem in this incident. Would you give your perspective about how this commitment problem was overcome?
So on the first question, why there's no stars of
So
correlation?
maybe you should provide a little background, because not everybody in the audience knows the details of the Xi'an incident.
Okay.
What happened, so.
So let me talk about Xi'an incidents. So in 1930, close to 1936, when the CCP finally, after the Long March, reached Yan'an, they have about 10,000 people left. When they reach Yan'an, it's not that they're safe. And actually, there was, on the south, and then, just all corner, they were surrounded by KMT troops. Two of the important troops are the northeastern and northwestern armies, controlled by Zhang Xuanliang, the son of Zhang Boling, one of the warlord in the northeast part of China that Manchuria later get captured by Japan, and then Yang Hucheng. So those two really want to force Chiang Kai-shek to fight the Japanese rather than the CCP. So when Chiang Kai-shek flew to Xi'an, want to witness this final blow to the CCP, what he didn't know is that one night, Yang Hucheng Jiang stages coup d'etat and house arrest him. So there's a lot of historical debates, actually, why they don't just kill Chiang Kai-shek, and there's a different topics. This is, but the long story short, that it forced him to promise not to attack the CCP, form the Second United Front, and to fight the Japanese. Okay, so I think your question is why Chiang Kai-shek, after release from the house arrest and did not break the promise. Well, actually, he did. The first thing he did is, so Yang Hucheng and Zhang Xueliang later get house arrest themselves, right? And the second thing is that KMT initially tried to absorb the CCP into them. But the CCP learned a lesson after First United Front that they have to maintain independent control of the military. So this is the core fighting, contention, the bargaining between the CCP and KMT, that how many troops they can keep and how and what type of control. And that bargaining negotiation never able to settle, and then there was a skirmish among the CCP and KMT until 1940, the Wannan Shibian, when they collapsed, and the Second United Front collapsed. So in that sense, I think Chiang Kai-shek did not follow through his promise to that extent, and then that Second United Front collapsed was the testaments about credible commitment problem that you indicated earlier. And just quick notes, there's in the book there regression the table is another thing, but Victor warned me about not to present any of those for this audience. That's why none of them are here. So I have more to show in the book and then also in the paper. So, yeah.
During World War II, what role did the United States play between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek? What was the relationships during the war?
I think during the war, my understanding is that, well, United States really want both parties fight the Japanese so to help mitigate the threat from the Pacific War. Okay, and that's why you have a flying tiger, the airplane that go beyond from the bad side, southeast side of China, the United States provide all the military aids. And actually, when the Dixie missions visit Yan'an, there's documents show that Mao was actually trying to appeal to the United States for their support. Because Mao didn't see Soviet Union as I would say as the only source of support. If anything, that during the ratification campaign, he's really trying to eliminate any remaining Kuomintang Soviet influence into the elite politics. So, but as I mentioned earlier, Dixie mission I think the only group of people saw it coming, that CCP have a stronger organizational power in the Civil War. And they wrote a letter, the report to Washington, but Washington decides, during the height of anti-communist, sentiments, ignore them. So in that sense, I think to recapture, I think the United States initially is really just focused us not in the fighting among the two parties so that they can fight the Japanese at the same time to mitigate the threat from the Pacific War. And later, during the mediation, that collapsed, and the United States, at the time, the ideology is really anything but communist. So they support the KMT, they pick the KMT over the CCP. Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Xiabao. I am Sincere from the political science department, and I have learned so much from the talk today, and I've got your book. I have two primary questions. The first one is, how would you relate your book, your study to the vast works kind of
Can you speak a little louder?
Okay. How would you try to relate your work the vast works on social revolutions? Because there are so similar books on it talking about the importance of a strong man, the importance of kind of leadership to foster the success of a party. And then this is my first question. The second one is, do you think that this kind of strongman rule would continue to influence post-war governance? Because as we all know, the KMT and the CCP have chosen somewhat different but something similar rule of governance after 1949. So how would you attribute such kind of divergence to their pre-war party building style?
Thank you for your questions. On your first question, I think there's a lot of study talking about social revolution and political revolutions. I think my major departure here is I'm trying to focus on the play and of the organizations, how they gain strength and through this process. Because in the protracted conflicts, you really need to have a strong organization to withstand those conflicts and to survive and even succeed later. So my focus here has been complete on the organizational building in this broader context. On your second question,
And of course, the fiscal side,
yes,
I think is.
that's another
Additional for the study of revolutions.
yes, that's another part that I'm trying to, extensions from the organizational mobile infrastructure is not just for the activists, but also the financial resources. And this on the second question, that's where my last chapter talking about the victim of their own success. Because to be honest with you, that the CCP was right in their narrative is that without Mao, CCP would not have succeeded. Not necessarily because his vision, because he did have visions and strategies, but importantly, he really, mitigated the internal conflict. But that lead to this myth that the CCP, the Chinese need to have a strong man. That we all know that led to the development of personal account. Because pre-49 Mao is very different from the post-49 Mao. The pre-49 Mao is actually very open-minded and listened, suggestions from his colleagues. And that's where the post-49 Mao was so in a way building his personal account and dominant and monopolize the power. And that's where Peng Dehuai, during the Lushan meetings, got purged in that he was like, you're not the same person that I can just come down and talk to you, right? So in some way that this victim of his own success now in the Chinese political system, sometimes we always, in the system, they look up for the great man to save the party, save the country. But the paradox of having a great man is that they're going to leave behind a vacuum because when they were in power and they're going to, just like Victor spoke, right, have a coalition for weeks, not having a strong subordinate. And when they, leave office, whether by natural or non-natural causes, that's going to lead to a political vacuum that people are going to fight against among each other.
Yeah. Or
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I have two questions. So the first question is related to your response earlier. I'm curious to know if you could elaborate a little bit more on the scope conditions of the blessing of the dominant leader. Because I think if it is the key ingredients for their success, you also mentioned it's also, they become a victim of their own success. So what are the conditions that will actually make the dominant leader is actually helpful for party building instead of undermining the party's power? And the second question is, I think you identified three key components, like the dominant leader, resource mobilization, and also contingencies. I think underlying that it was like a time dimension. I was wondering if you could speculate in terms of whether those key components, is there like a sequential component in terms of when certain components is more important and how would we consider them, like how they're actually aligned together to make this reversal happen?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to think about the scope conditions, to talk about it. As we know that in social science, there's no theory that can travel without any boundaries. So the boundary for my theory is really look at a weak institutionalized society and talking about the development of political organization before they seize the state power. Okay, that's most applicable to those kind of situations. So might think about today, even some rebel group, insurgency groups that might be able to travel, they have a consolidated leadership. Because you look at this, some other insurgencies in the communists or other movements, when they have a build a broad coalition with a different elite, they're fighting for resources that later the movement collapse. In terms of time dimensions, I think it's not that you need strong leader and then the resource mobilization, have to come first. I would say both of them are important at the same time. And contingency is just a factor shaping those equilibriums among each other. So back in my mind, the way that I developed this theory is that I'm not sure the time, the sequencing is an important factor here.
Okay, do we have time for one more? No. And this is the problem with online talks. We have to bring it to a close, but I'm sure Xiabao would be willing to answer questions after the end of the formal presentation. But I do want to announce to you and to the online audience that we have an online event on November 13th, in which we're going to bring together a lot of poll data from our own 21st Century China Center, China from the Ground Up project, from the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, and from the School of International Relations at Tsinghua, to talk about public opinion in China today and what recent surveys reveal. And it'll be really interesting because Da Lei, who is the head of the center at Tsinghua, is going to join us virtually, as well as our own Molly Roberts and Dina Schmeltz from the Chicago Council and Liu Yawei as well. So that'll be very interesting discussion about public opinion in China today. That's November 13th at 4:00. So thanks very much. Thanks for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in future 21st Century China Center events. Thank you.
Thank you.